A single photograph taken in 1888 inside a modest portrait studio. A black family dressed in their finest clothing, looking directly into the camera with quiet dignity and calm pride. For more than a century, this image rested forgotten in an archive, just another piece of the past that no one paid attention to. But when modern genetic scientists used advanced imaging technology to study the matriarch's eyes, they discovered something astonishing, a pattern within her irises that should have been impossible, a genetic signature that traced back across the ocean through centuries of history to African royalty the world had long forgotten. This was not simply a family photograph. It was proof of a bloodline that slavery had tried to erase. If you want to discover how a single photograph changed history and helped reconnect a family with their royal roots, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. You will not believe where this story leads. Dr. Maya Richardson stood in the basement of the Smithsonian Institution, surrounded by cardboard boxes that carried the smell of dust and time. She had been working on the African American Heritage Photography Project for 3 months, cataloging thousands of images from the post-Civil War period. Most of them were damaged, faded, or barely recognizable. But on this particular morning in March 2019, she opened a box labeled Virginia Studios 1880 to 1890 and discovered something that made her stop. The photograph was surprisingly well preserved. A family of 6 sat and stood in a formal studio arrangement. The background showed a painted garden scene, very typical for that time. The father stood tall in a dark suit, one hand resting gently on the shoulder of his seated wife. 4 children surrounded them, 2 boys and 2 girls, all dressed in their Sunday best clothing. Their faces looked serious, dignified, almost royal. Maya carefully lifted the photograph, noticing the photographer's stamp on the back. J. Morrison Studio, Richmond, Virginia, September 1888. She had seen hundreds of portraits similar to this one, but something about it felt unusual. The family's posture, the way they carried themselves, suggested a pride that rose above their difficult circumstances. She placed the image on her light table and reached for her magnifying glass, beginning her normal documentation process. Age, condition, subjects, location. But when she leaned closer to examine the small details, her breath suddenly paused. The woman sitting at the center, the matriarch of the family, had the most remarkable eyes Maya had ever seen in a photograph from that time period. Even through the sepia tones and the limitations of 19th century photography, there was something different about them, a clarity that should not have been possible with the technology available in 1888. Maya leaned back slowly, frowning in thought. She had worked with historical photographs for years and understood what was normal for that era. The early emulsion methods, the long exposure times, and the simple lenses all created certain limits. Eyes in old portraits were usually dark, slightly blurred, and lacking detail. But this woman's eyes were different. Sharp, almost glowing. And there was a visible pattern inside the irises that Maya could not clearly see with a magnifying glass alone. She glanced at the clock. It was almost noon. Her colleague, Dr. James Chen, worked upstairs in the digital imaging laboratory. If anyone could help her confirm what she was seeing, or tell her she was imagining things, it would be him. Maya carefully placed the photograph into a protective sleeve and walked toward the elevator. James looked up from his computer screen when Maya entered the imaging lab, holding the sleeve as if it contained something extremely valuable. He had worked with her long enough to recognize that expression on her face, the one that meant she had discovered something interesting. "What did you find?" he asked, pushing his chair slightly away from the desk. "I'm not completely sure yet," Maya replied, gently placing the photograph onto the scanning bed. "But there is something unusual about this woman's eyes. I need you to scan it at the highest resolution possible." James raised one eyebrow but did not question her request. He had learned to trust Maya's instincts. He adjusted the settings on the professional archival scanner and began the process. The machine hummed quietly as it captured every tiny detail of the 131-year-old photograph. 5 minutes later, the scan appeared on his monitor. James opened the file in specialized imaging software and began zooming in on the matriarch's face. Maya stood beside him, her hand resting on the back of his chair. "There," she whispered, pointing at the screen. "Do you see it?" James leaned closer, narrowing his eyes. Then he zoomed in even further, focusing completely on the woman's left eye. The iris filled the entire screen, and what they saw made both of them fall silent. The pattern was unmistakable, even through the limits of 19th century photography, and despite more than a century of aging, the structure of her iris showed a unique configuration. Deep, radial furrows, an unusually pronounced colorette, and a distinct arrangement of crypts that formed an almost geometric pattern. "That's," James started to say, then stopped. He opened another window on his computer and pulled up a database he had been using for a different project, a genetic iris pattern recognition system developed by the National Institute of Health. He entered the pattern from the photograph, carefully adjusting for the image quality and its age. The software processed the information for about 30 seconds, comparing the pattern against thousands of known genetic markers. When the results appeared, James leaned back heavily in his chair. "Maya, this pattern is connected to a very specific genetic lineage. It's extremely rare. We're talking about something found in less than 1% of the world's population." He scrolled through the information on the screen, his expression becoming more serious. "And according to this data, it is connected with a particular ancestral line from West Central Africa." Maya felt her heart begin to race. "Can you narrow it down more?" she asked. James clicked through several additional screens, then slowly turned to face her. "Angola, more specifically the royal bloodlines of the pre-colonial Ndongo Kingdom." 2 days later, Maya sat across from Dr. Patricia Okonkwo in a small office at Howard University. Patricia was one of the leading genealogists, specializing in African-American family histories, especially those tracing back to the period of slavery. Her office walls were covered with family trees, maps showing Atlantic slave trade routes, and photographs of people she had helped reconnect with their heritage. Maya had brought both the original photograph and James's digital analysis. She watched as Patricia studied everything carefully, with the attention of someone who understood that these small pieces of the past were sometimes all that remained for many families. "The iris pattern is certain?" Patricia asked, lifting her eyes from the genetic report. "According to the NIH database, yes," Maya replied. "This specific configuration is connected to a genetic marker found almost only in descendants of the Ndongo royal family." "I know the history," Patricia said softly. "Queen Nangziga, one of Africa's greatest leaders. She resisted Portuguese colonization for almost 40 years. She looked again at the photograph. "And you're saying this woman photographed in Richmond, Virginia in 1888 carries that same bloodline?" "That is what the genetic evidence suggests." Patricia stayed quiet for a long moment, studying the matriarch's face. "Do we have any information about the family? Names? Anything written on the photograph?" Maya shook her head. "Only the studio stamp. J. Morrison Studio in Richmond. I have been searching Richmond city records from that time, but without names, it is nearly impossible." Patricia slowly reached for her laptop and opened a database she had built over 20 years of research. "Morrison Studio. I recognize that name." John Morrison was one of the few photographers in Richmond who regularly took portraits of black families during that time. He kept very detailed ledgers. She began typing quickly. "I have copies of some of his records. Let me check." She scrolled through scanned pages of handwritten entries, squinting at the faded ink, dates, names, payments, short descriptions of photo sessions. "Here," she said suddenly, turning the screen toward Maya. "September 14th, 1888. Family portrait. 6 subjects. Name listed as..." She paused and read carefully. "The Thomas family. No first names listed, but there is an address. 412 Clay Street, Richmond." Maya leaned forward, her pulse beating faster. "Tha, 'tis them, it must be. Same date, same number of people. Morrison charged them $2. That was expensive at that time. They must have saved money for this portrait." Patricia's expression softened. "They wanted to be remembered." Maya arrived in Richmond on a grey Thursday morning. The city had changed greatly since 1888, but traces of its history were still visible in the older neighborhoods, the brick buildings, and the church steeples that still rose above the modern skyline. She went directly to the Library of Virginia, where Patricia had arranged access to city directories and census records from the late 19th century. The research room was quiet, occupied by only a few historians and genealogists studying their own pieces of the past. A librarian named Mr. Lawson brought her the materials she had requested: Richmond city directories from 1885 to 1890, census records from 1880 and 1900, and property tax documents from the same period. Maya began with the 1888 directory. She slowly moved her finger down the listings for Clay Street, searching for house number 412. The entries were organized by street and number, with the head of household listed, along with his occupation. Then she saw it. 412 Clay Street. Thomas Samuel, carpenter. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote the name down. Samuel Thomas, the man standing in the photograph, his hand resting on his wife's shoulder, a carpenter. She quickly turned to the 1880 census records. Searching for Samuel Thomas in Richmond, she found him on the 4th page. Samuel Thomas, age 24. Black carpenter. Born in Virginia, and listed under him his wife, whose name made Mia pause for a moment. Grace Thomas, age 22, born in Virginia. Grace, the matriarch, finally had a name. Now Mia looked carefully at the census entry, then shifted her eyes to the notes column. Most entries were empty, or only shoe, wed simple jobs, but next to Grace's name, someone had written in small, tight handwriting, midwife, healer. Maya continued slowly down the census page. 4 children were listed: Robert, age 5, Elizabeth, age 4, Thomas Jr., age 2, and Mary, age 1. The same 4 children from the photograph taken 8 years later. But it was the next entry that made Maya sit upright in her chair. Under a section labeled Parents, Birthplace, there were 2 columns, one for father and one for mother, for both Samuel and Grace. The father's birthplace was written as Virginia, but for Grace's mother, someone had written unknown, possibly foreign. 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 In 1880, for a black woman living in Virginia, that note was extremely unusual. It suggested something different about Grace's background, something that did not follow the usual story of enslaved people born in the American South. Maya quickly pulled out her phone and sent a message to Patricia. Found them, Samuel and Grace Thomas. And there is something strange about Grace's mother. Patricia called her back within just a few minutes. Churches, she said immediately. If Grace was a midwife and healer in the black community, the churches would likely have records, baptisms, marriages, funerals. They often kept better records than the city offices did, especially for black families. Maya spent the rest of that day visiting historically black churches in Richmond. Many had been destroyed or moved during the decades, but 3 still remained from the 1880s. First African Baptist Church, Ebenezer Baptist Church, and St. Philip's Episcopal Church. It was at Ebenezer Baptist, inside a dusty archive room that smelled of old paper and lemon oil, that she finally discovered what she had been searching for. Reverend Marcus Williams, a man in his 70s, who acted as the church's unofficial historian, brought her a large leather-bound ledger from 1875. We have kept every record since 1802, he said with quiet pride. Baptisms, marriages, deaths. This community has always believed that memory matters. Maya opened the ledger gently. The pages were filled with neat, elegant handwriting, each entry listing names, dates, and sometimes short personal notes. She began searching through the baptism records first, hoping to find the Thomas children. She found them. Robert baptized in 1876, Elizabeth in 1877, Thomas Jr. in 1879, Mary in 1880, all 4 children with their parents listed as Samuel and Grace Thomas. Then she flipped back further to the year 1874. and found an entry that made her heart beat faster. Marriage. Samuel Thomas to Grace Odell, October 3rd, 1874. Witnesses. Jacob Freeman. Ruth. Freeman. Odell was not a common name in Virginia, and not common anywhere in America. In 1874, Maya's hands shook slightly as she took a photograph of the page with her phone. Reverend Williams leaned over her shoulder and read the entry quietly. Odell, he said slowly. That sounds like a Yoruba name from Nigeria. He paused for a moment, but many enslaved people from Angola were sometimes given Yoruba names by slave traders. Different cultures became mixed together during the Middle Passage. Maya looked up at him. Is there anything else about Grace? Any other records? The Reverend thought for a moment, then walked to another shelf. He pulled down a different ledger, this one from the 1870s. We also have some personal testimonies from that time, he explained. People who joined the church had to give a testimony and tell their story. He turned through several pages before stopping. Here it is. Grace Odell joined the church in 1873 before her marriage. There is a note here, written by Reverend Johnson. Maya read the faded handwriting slowly. Grace came to us with unusual knowledge of healing herbs. Claims her mother taught her. Mother deceased. Grace refuses to speak about her origins. Maya returned to Washington with even more questions than answers. She now had a name, Grace Odell, but the mystery had only grown deeper. Why would Grace refuse to speak about her past? What had happened to her mother? And most importantly, how did a woman living in post-Civil War Virginia carry the genetic signature of Angolan royalty? Back at the Smithsonian, she met with James and Patricia through a video call. James had been running more analyses on the iris pattern, comparing it with expanded genetic databases. Patricia had been searching through slave ship records and auction documents, looking for any mention of the name Odell. I found something, Patricia said, her face serious on the screen. There was a slave ship called the Esperanza that arrived in Charleston, South Carolina in 1847. It was a Portuguese vessel that came from Luanda, Angola. The cargo list recorded 217 enslaved people, though I am certain many others died during the journey. Maya leaned closer to the screen. Did you find the name Odell? No, Patricia said, but I found something else. There is a note about a woman and her young daughter who were separated from the main group when they arrived. They were described as a special acquisition and were sold privately, not at the normal auction. The note says the woman claimed to be of royal blood. The room became completely silent. James finally spoke. Do we have any way to prove this woman was Grace's mother? Not directly, Patricia admitted, but the timeline fits. If Grace was born around 1858, as the census suggests, and her mother arrived in 1847, she could have been pregnant when she was enslaved, or soon after. The fact that they were sold privately suggests someone believed their claim about royal heritage, or at least believed they were valuable. May stared at the photograph on her desk. Grace's face, captured in that Richmond studio in 1888, seemed to look back at her through time. We need to find out what happened to that woman and her daughter after they were sold in Charleston. Where did they go? How did they end up in Virginia? Patricia nodded. I will search the Charleston private sale records. Some wealthy families kept detailed notes about their purchases, especially when they paid higher prices. And I will continue working on the genetic analysis, James added. If we can locate any living descendants of the Thomas family, we might be able to confirm the royal connection through DNA testing. Maya picked up the photograph again, studying Grace's eyes carefully. Somewhere in those eyes was a story that had remained hidden for more than 170 years, a story about queens and kingdoms, about survival and silence. 3 weeks later, Patricia called Maya with news that changed everything. She had discovered the private sale record inside the archives of the Middleton family, a wealthy Charleston plantation dynasty that had carefully kept records of their purchases. Her name was Nzenga, Patricia said, her voice heavy with emotion. The woman who arrived on the Esperanza in 1847 was named Nzenga. The buyer, Charles Middleton, wrote in his private ledger that she claimed to be descended from Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matumba. He did not believe her, but he bought her anyway because she was young and strong. The child with her was about 2 years old. He did not write down the child's name. Maya closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the discovery. Nzinga. She named herself after the queen. Or perhaps she truly was related to her. There is more, Patricia continued. The ledger says Nzinga was sold again in 1852 to a Virginia tobacco plantation owner named Richard Blackwell. Both she and her daughter were sold together. Blackwell's plantation was about 30 miles south of Richmond. What happened to them there? Maya asked quietly. I do not know yet, Patricia replied, but I found a note in the Blackwell family papers at the Virginia Historical Society. I am driving there tomorrow to examine them. Do you want to meet me there? The next afternoon, Maya and Patricia sat together in the reading room of the Virginia Historical Society, surrounded by boxes filled with Blackwell family documents. They eventually found the note in a letter written in 1858 by Richard Blackwell's wife, Eleanor, to her sister in Maryland. Eleanor wrote, "The African woman Nzinga died in childbirth last week. She delivered a baby girl who survived. The infant is remarkably beautiful and has unusual eyes. I have decided to keep the child in the house and train her as a lady's maid. The other daughter, who must be nearly 13 now, works in the kitchen. She has her mother's knowledge of healing and has saved 3 of our children from fever this year alone. Richard wants to sell her, but I have refused." Maya looked at Patricia slowly. The baby born in 1858, that must be Grace, and the older daughter was her half-sister, born in Africa or during the voyage. Patricia's hands trembled slightly as she turned the page. This means Grace never knew her mother, and Nzinga died the day Grace was born. They sat quietly for a long moment, imagining the scene. A woman dying during childbirth on a Virginia plantation, far away from her homeland, far away from the royal history she had carried across the ocean, and a newborn girl opening her eyes for the first time, carrying in her eyes the genetic proof of her ancestry. Maya understood that proving the genetic connection would require finding living descendants of Samuel and Grace Thomas. The photograph and historical documents told a powerful story, but DNA evidence would make it undeniable. She began with the 1900 census, tracing what happened to the family after the photograph was taken. Samuel had died in 1895, but Grace lived until 1912. The 4 children from the photograph grew up, married, and had children of their own. The trail eventually led Maya to a woman named Dorothy Williams, who lived in Philadelphia. Dorothy was 76 years old, and according to the genealogical records Patricia had compiled, she was the great-great-granddaughter of Robert Thomas, the oldest son in the photograph. Maya called her on a Tuesday evening, her heart beating fast. The phone rang 3 times before a warm voice answered. "Mrs. Williams, my name is Dr. Maya Richardson. I am a historian with the Smithsonian Institution, and I have been researching your family history. I found a photograph from 1888 that I believe shows your great-great-grandparents." There was a long pause on the phone. "You found a picture of my family?" "Yes, ma'am. Your great-great-grandfather Samuel Thomas, your great-great-grandmother Grace, and their 4 children. The photo was taken in Richmond, Virginia." Dorothy's voice trembled slightly. "We do not have any pictures from that time, not even one. The family stories say a portrait was made once, but it was lost during the Depression when my grandmother had to move away. We always wished we could see their faces." Maya felt tears building in her own eyes. "Mrs. Williams, I would like to come visit you and show you the photograph, but there is something else too. We have made a discovery about your great-great-great-grandmother Grace, something very unusual about her ancestry. Would you be willing to take a DNA test?" "What kind of discovery?" Maya chose her words with care. "We have evidence suggesting Grace was the daughter of a woman who came from Angola and belonged to a royal bloodline. Her genetic mark. Rare shows she may have been descended from one of the most powerful queens in African history. The silence on the other side of the call lasted so long. Maya thought the line had disconnected. Then Dorothy spoke again, her voice calm but filled with emotion. My grandmother used to tell me stories about Grace. She said Grace had healing hands, that she could look at someone and understand what was wrong deep inside them. She said Grace had eyes that seemed to know things, ancient things. Dorothy paused for a moment and then continued. She also said Grace always told her children, "Remember that you come from kings and queens. Never forget that." 6 weeks later, Maya returned to Philadelphia with James and Patricia. They met Dorothy in her living room, where 3 generations of her family had gathered together. Her daughter Karen sat beside her on the couch. Her grandson Marcus, a college student studying history, stood quietly near the window. All of them wanted to hear the truth. James opened his laptop and pulled up the results from the genetic analysis. He had compared Dorothy's DNA sample with the markers that had been identified in Grace's iris pattern from the photograph, and then cross-checked everything with genetic databases from Angola. "The results are clear," he began. "Dorothy, you carry the same genetic markers that we found in your great-great-grandmother's eyes. These markers are extremely rare. They appear in less than 0.1% of the world's population, and they match the genetic signature connected to the Ndongo royal family." He showed them a chart displaying the genetic lineage. Queen Nzinga ruled the kingdom of Ndongo and Matamba from 1624 until 1663. She fought against Portuguese colonization for almost 40 years, defending her people and their freedom. According to the genetic evidence, Grace was her direct descendant. About 7 generations late, Dorothy lifted her hand to cover her mouth. Karen leaned closer and held her mother's other hand tightly. Marcus stepped nearer, staring at the glowing screen. "How is that even possible?" Marcus asked. "How could a queen's descendant end up enslaved in Virginia?" Patricia began explaining what they had discovered in the historical records. She told them about Nzinga, the woman who arrived on the ship Esperanza in 1847, claiming royal blood. She explained how that woman had been sold to the Blackwell plantation, how she died while giving birth to Grace in 1858, never returning to her homeland again. "Your great-great-grandmother Grace never knew her mother," Patricia said softly, "but she carried her legacy in every cell of her body, in the healing knowledge that was passed to her from an older half-sister, and in her eyes, those unique eyes that showed traces of her royal heritage." Maya gently placed the photograph on the coffee table. Dorothy leaned forward slowly, seeing her ancestors' faces for the first time in her life. She traced her finger across Grace's image, over those striking eyes that looked directly into the camera lens in 1888, holding a secret that would remain hidden for 131 years. "She looks like my grandmother," Dorothy whispered, "and like my mother, and like Karen." She looked up at Maya, tears running down her face. "All these years we had the stories, but we never had proof. We never had something like this." Marcus carefully lifted the photograph in his hands. "She looks like a queen." "Because she was descended from one," James said quietly. 3 months later, on a warm afternoon in September. "Or 3 months," In said quietly. "Exactly 131 years after the original photograph had been taken, Dorothy and her family stood inside the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The photograph that had started everything had now become part of the museum. Permanent collection, displayed alongside documents, explaining Grace's royal lineage. But this gathering was not really about museum displays or exhibitions. It was about family. Dorothy had worked closely with Patricia to trace every branch of the Thomas family tree, and today more than 40 descendants of Samuel and Grace Thomas had gathered together from across the country. Many of them were meeting for the very first time. Maya watched as everyone stood around a large screen that showed the digitally restored photograph. She could see Grace's features appearing again and again in many faces, the same strong jawline, the same proud posture, and in several people those same distinctive eyes. An older man named Joseph, who had traveled all the way from Atlanta, stood quietly staring at the image of his great-great-grandfather Samuel. I still have his carpentry tools, he said softly. They have been passed down through my family for generations. I never knew what he looked like until today. A young woman named Alia, Dorothy's great niece, stood beside him. She had Grace's eyes, the same unusual iris pattern that had started the entire investigation. When James tested her DNA as part of the expanded family study, the royal genetic markers had been unmistakable. I always felt there was something special about our family, Alia said, like there was a story we were missing. My grandmother used to say we came from greatness, but she never knew exactly how or why. She just felt it in her heart. Dorothy looked at the gathered relatives and spoke to them, her voice steady and strong. Grace died in 1912, never knowing that the truth about her mother would someday be discovered. She never knew that science would one day prove what her mother Ninga had claimed, that they were descendants of a warrior queen who stood against an empire. But Grace knew her value. She knew her strength, and she made sure we understood ours. She looked around the room, at the many faces of her family. Doctors, teachers, artists, parents, students, all of them carrying Grace's legacy forward into the future. This photograph was meant to be a memory, Dorothy continued. Samuel and Grace paid $2 they could barely afford, so their children would remember their faces. But it became more than just a memory. It became evidence, proof that our ancestors were not only survivors, they were royalty, and that is something no one can ever take away from us again. Marcus raised his phone and took a photograph of everyone standing together. History repeating itself. Another family portrait, another moment saved forever. But this time, they knew exactly who they were.